This is Kay Rudolph with part 2 in the series Documenting the Legend, based on A Love Story Proved: The Life and Family of Laura Lavinia Kelly Combs of Atlanta and Augusta, Georgia, by Paul K. Graham, published in the National Genealogical Society Journal, December 2013. I selected this article for a case study because it offers opportunities to really explore a wide variety of resources. And in this lesson today, we're going to be discussing censuses, deeds, city directories, and historical maps. The legend on which this case study is based comes from a book published in 1894 on the history of the African American community at Atlanta. It mentions a Mary Combs as the first colored person to own property in Atlanta. Her property was said to occupy the place where Wheat Street meets Peachtree Street. And most intriguingly, this property she sold, it says, and with the proceeds purchased her husband. In 1977, research documenting this story was published in the Atlanta Historical Bulletin, but in our last video, we saw how that information was demonstrated to be incorrect. Our plan today is to find the Mary Combs that was discussed in Carter's 1894 book. We will look at the 1850 and 1860 censuses for Atlanta, searching for a Mary Combs who was an adult female and a free woman of color. We'll also use the Atlanta city directories to look for a Mary Combs residing at that location of Wheat and Peachtree before the Civil War. Starting with family search, I did a simple search for Mary and Combs, not specifying any restrictions on the name, but specifying a restriction to Atlanta, Georgia. Note that I don't list the county. That's because the county did change over that period of time, and it's easier just to exclude that. I limited the collection searched to the 1850 census and find no results. Now, it's always a good idea to check both Family Search and Ancestry Heritage Quest indexes, because indexers can look at an enumerator's writing and see different words entirely. And so to cover our bases, I also checked the Ancestry or Heritage Quest for Mary Combs with a selection of exact sounds like or similar to the given name Mary, exact sounds like or similar to the surname Combs, and restricting it to Atlanta, Fulton, Georgia, exactly. With Ancestry and Heritage Quest, it's important to select one of the geographic standard formats for a location because of the way they index those collections. And so I want to take use of that indexing. So I've done the search here. We find one result for 1860 for a Mary Combs living in Atlanta and Fulton County, Georgia. Taking a closer look at it here, we see Mary, age 30, female, living with a Jane, age 50, both born in Georgia. But note here, this column, which would have indicated if they were African American, colored, black, is blank, indicating that these women were recorded as white. Well, let's take a closer look at this family and track them forward in later censuses. In 1870, Mary Combs is recorded in the household of Cece Rhodes and Sarah Rhodes. In 1880, that individual is Charles Rhodes and Sally J., Sally being a nickname for Sarah. Here she is recorded as the mother-in-law of the head of household, Charles, suggesting that she is Sally's mother. She is recorded in both the 1870 and 1880 census as being white. Now this name Charles Rhodes, that rings a bell. Last video we explored the deeds for a Mary Combs selling land in Atlanta, and we found an 1862 deed of sale from a Mary Combs and Charles C. Rhodes selling a piece of property which turned out not to be the property that we were looking for, the wheat and peach tree. As an aside, I want you to note that this deed we're looking at here in volume TT was a re-recording in 1891 of a deed that had been recorded in Fulton County Records Book H in 1865. That Book H is no longer available to us. So it's something to note that sometimes if you don't find a deed, you may find it being re-recorded at a later date. So going back to family search, I'd like to be able to search the 1850 census for any free woman of color living in Atlanta, but family search does not allow us the option to search by race in the 1850 census, nor in the 1860 census. To make things worse, nor does Ancestry or Heritage Quest in either the 1850 census nor the 1860 census. So what are my options? When I look at the number of individuals that were enumerated in the 1860 census in Atlanta, that's 7,000 plus. That's too many for me to do a line-by-line search. However, when I look at the 1850 census for Atlanta, there's only 2,000 plus individuals enumerated. That is a manageable number of pages to have to search. And so I'm going to go ahead and do that. I'm going to do a page-by-page search looking for individuals of color, looking particularly for a female of an age to be married before the Civil War. It's a fairly simple thing to do. I just start at page 1 of that section on Atlanta in DeKalb County and thumb through. I'm paying attention to this column that lists race, and I create a list of all the individuals who are listed as Black or mulatto in Atlanta in the 1850 census. I come up with less than a score of people, and I've highlighted in pink those who are women of an age where they might have been married before the Civil War. And one in particular catches my eye, Laura Combs. She is living alone, a 30-year-old female listed as Black. Next, I want to take a look at the city directories. These are the equivalent of an annual census, in that every year you get a listing of the adults who are living in a particular location. It turns out that, and we knew this from the last lesson, the first directory to Atlanta wasn't published until 1859-1860. That means that the information in this directory was probably collected in late 1858, possibly early 1859. We simply thumb through to the C's and we see Miss Mary Combs and Miss Jane Combs, but notice where they're living. This says their house is on the southeast corner of Wheat and Pryor. Now, let's take a look at that location of Wheat and Pryor. There is a lovely map of Atlanta from 1871. We can zoom in And we see here is Wheat Street running into, and here is Pryor that runs north. So the southeast corner of Wheat and Pryor would be this house here. But if you extend Pryor up, you see it becomes Peachtree Street. So this property is effectively at the corner of Wheat Street and Peachtree Street, as described by Carter in the 1894 history of the African American community in Atlanta. So what do we know now? We know that in 1850, Laura Combs was a 30-year-old black female living in Atlanta. And we know that in 1859, Mary Combs, a white female, lived at the corner of Wheat and Pryor, which was the location that Carter identified as Wheat and Peachtree. In 1870, Mary Combs was living with Charles Rhodes, and in 1880, she was listed as the mother-in-law of Rhodes. That would make her the mother of Sally. So our plan then is to locate deeds related to any Combs purchasing or selling that lot at the corner of Wheat Street and Pryor Street. We're going to want to track Mary and Jane Combs through the censuses and identify all possible heirs who may have created documents related to that property. We've already looked at them in the 1860 census and found Mary in the 1870 and 1880 living with Charles Rhodes. Here we're taking a closer look at the image of the 1880 census. A couple of things to note. At this point, they are not living on the Wheat or Peachtree. They're living on Loyal Street. So it's possible that the property has already been sold out of the family. You also want to note the spellings of the names. Sometimes we've seen Rhodes as R-H-O-D-E-S, sometimes as R-O-D-E-S. We're going to want to keep both in mind. So we've put together the list of names that we're going to search for in deed books. Combs, possibly written with 2 O's. Charles C. Rhodes, with or without the H. Sally or Sarah Rhodes, with or without the H. Let's go to the family search catalog and open up the land records with the deed collections for Fulton County and look at this collection of index to deeds. We're going to start with this master index of deeds covering the period 1854 to 1871. First, a warning. Master indexes that cover multiple years are transcriptions of the individual annual indexes. And you always want to be cautious about using transcriptions and relying on them solely. Let me give you an example. This is the probate record index for the county of Madison, covering the period 1819 to 1916. I was particularly interested in the Taylor family, and so I was happy to see a notation for William Taylor's final settlement. But I want to draw your attention to the master index for Book 4. It tells us that page 5 is the first document related to with the surname T, and that's for Randolph Turner. And the next document in Book 4 for somebody with the surname T isn't until page 36 for Samuel Tyndall. But let's take a look at Book 4 itself and look at the original index for Book 4 on which that master transcription was based. When you take a look here, there is our page 5, Randolph Turner, and there is page 36, Samuel Tyndall. But what do we see tucked in between them? On page 21, there is John Taylor's will. There was no mention of John Taylor's will on the master index. My warning to you here is be careful of transcriptions. They can be very helpful for getting you quickly to the information that you need, but don't assume that if the names you're looking for are not listed, that they don't exist. You may want to go back and look at the original indexes directly. Another warning, beware of microfilm or its digitized images. And here is an example from this case study. We're looking at the master index for Fulton County, and we're thumbing through to find the page for Combs. Page 15 of that master index appears on image number 34 of this collection. Image number 35, the following image, is for page 17. You don't find page 16 until image 233. So it was on image 233 that I found the entries for Jane and Mary Combs. The researchers went through looking for Combs and Rhodes, and they identified 5 deeds related to that property at Wheat and Pryor. And within those 5, they found clues to a 6th deed that turned out to be crucial. Let's take a look at the story of those 5 deeds. In October of 1860, a lot at the corner of Wheat and Pryor Street, bounded by a lot occupied by E.W. Munday, was sold to Daniel Pittman in a sheriff's auction to satisfy a judgment against Jane and Mary Combs. That was the first deed. The second deed was for that same day, and it showed Daniel Pittman transferring the property back to Jane Combs for a nominal $1. We don't have any information as to why that was, whether there was an additional mortgage on the side or some private arrangement or some personal relationship, we don't know. A few months later, Jane sold that lot to her niece, Mrs. Sarah J. Rhodes, for natural love and affection, which is a common term that you will see in transfers of property between relatives. So that takes us to our third deed. 10 years later, Jane Combs died. This was recorded in the fourth deed, which marked the 1885 sale of the property by Mrs. Sarah J. Rhodes to the YMCA for $12,000. Almost a year after that sale, there was a quitclaim recorded by Oswald A. Combs, quitclaiming all interest in that lot to Sarah J. Rhodes. That was our fifth deed. The clue to the sixth deed came out of the first deed's land description, where it is describing the lot formerly owned by John Silvey, now occupied by E.W. Munday. So notice how in these sort of meets and bounds descriptions, you frequently have the names of neighboring property owners. We're going to want to look for properties that might give us more information about that Wheat and Pryor lot. And we have here information that E.W. Munday's deeds may provide that information. So let's go back to the Family Search Catalog to the Fulton County Land and Property category and locate the master index again. In this case, we want to look at the master index for grantees, not grantors. Grantees or reverse index, this is the index by purchaser. Grantor or direct index is the index by sellers. So we open up the grantee index and we click on the first image in order to orient ourselves with this collection. And we find that the beginning of the image set is the letter P. And we're looking for Mondays. We would expect to find this beginning with the letters A. So I have to do a little bit of hunting around and figuring out how this set is organized. And I find the Mondays on image 454. We have a number of possible deeds that we might want to look at. Don't discount this one. It's Carolyn Monday, and you think, well, we're looking for EW, but it's Carolyn et al., which means Carolyn is one of a group of people. REW may be one of these et al. People. Looking over here, we can see that the books range from Volume C, Volume A, Volume G, Volume TT. I'd like to start looking with Volume A, and we'll work our way forward from there. So back to the deed, records, and mortgages. We are going to pick Volume A, 1854 to 1855. And again, I like to orient myself a little bit to see what I'm looking at. You notice how a number of these pages have a lot less writing than the others. These are at the beginning of the book. That's the index. Let's take a look at the index and double check the page numbers that we got from the master index. Here we're looking at the grantee sorting. We have Monday, Edmund, W, ED, MD, or it could be EDWD. And there are two deeds in this volume, one on page 328 and one on page 343. Let's thumb over to page 328 and scroll down. Here we have the deed from James F. Alexander of Fulton County and state aforesaid of the one part, and Edmund W. Monday of the same place of the other part. It turns out this is our crucial deed number 6, and the reason why is on the next page. This is the land description for this property that Edmund Monday has just bought from James Alexander. And the property is described as being divided, the south half being divided from the north half by a fence at present, standing on said lot and dividing the south half from the lot, now owned by Laura Combs, a free woman of color. So what do we know now? We know that Laura Combs, a free woman of color, owned the property at Wheat and Pryor in 1854. We know that from that deed when Monday purchased his property, which was to the south of it. We know that in 1859, Jane and Mary Combs were living at that corner of Wheat and Pryor. We have that from the city directory. The 1860 sheriff's sale is evidence that Jane was the legal owner of the property, in that this property was used to satisfy a legal debt. In 1885, Jane's heirs sold the lot, and a year later, a person named Oswald A. Combs signed a quitclaim to that property. So our next goal is going to be to solve this riddle of how the property of Laura Combs came to be in the hands of Jane and Mary Combs, and what the relationship of Oswald Combs is to any of this. That will be in part 3, where we solve the riddle and document the legend that was described to us by E.R. Carter in his 1894 History of Atlanta.